Once upon a time, there was a great king whose name was David. And David was the rare kind of political leader who everybody loved. And everybody, for the most part, loved rooting for. He had kind of a rags to riches story. He was the youngest of 8 boys. He was a shepherd who killed a giant super soldier. He was this rare combination of great artist and great warrior, and yet he was humble. In fact, God himself called King David a man after his own heart. David was a human being. And one day, while strolling on the rooftop patio of his palace, David sees a woman in her home bathing. And he's got a decision to make. He can keep looking in her direction, or he can just go about his day doing far more productive things. And so he decides to ask someone to find out who she is. Now, he learns that she's married, and when he does, he also learns that she's not just married, she's married to one of his elite bodyguards, someone who at that very moment was on the battlefield risking his life for king and for country. And when he learns that, David's got another decision to make. He can, let it be, or he can see it as a window to get away with something that he wants to do, but clearly knows that he shouldn't. And so he decides to summon this woman to his palace, and then he decides that he's going to sleep with her, and then he discovers that she is pregnant with his child, right? And at this point, even though he's very much still able to make decisions that go in a different direction, if he wanted to, the reality is he doesn't want to. He's just simply so far down this path that he's not going to make the right decision. He's created so much momentum in the wrong direction that he's decided it's in his best interest to just cover it up. And we don't have time to unpack all of how he tried to cover it up, but at the end of it all, David has worked out a way to kill this husband under the cover of a military battle and take the woman he widowed to be his wife. And then, problem solved. In fact, David even gets to be the hero of the story because he's making a widow into a queen. It's a rags to riches story, kind of like his, Only problem with all of this was, and David didn't account for this, but the only problem was that there is a God who sees. God can still see. And God saw him looking at this woman when he shouldn't have. God saw him summon someone else's wife to his bed when he shouldn't have. And God even saw him successfully conspire and murder to cover it all up. God saw all of that, which is a very uncomfortable thought. That's a very uncomfortable thought, that God sees all of that, right? Because David went far, far, far down this path, and on some level he knew was wrong, and God saw him take every single step, and God did nothing to stop him. But that, my friends, is reality. That's our reality. God lets us, he does, he lets all of us, you and me included, okay, do some pretty awful, pretty bad, pretty evil things to one another. But only to a point. Only to a point. See, God is holy. I mean, he's perfectly loving, he's perfectly righteous, and God is perfectly just. In other words, God keeps score. And he's going to balance the scales, and he's going to balance David's scales through a prophet named Nathan. Now, prophets at the time were people who God spoke directly to, and then who spoke those words to the people God wanted those messages delivered to. And so that's Nathan's job. But remember, God allows us to do evil things. So even though he's given Nathan a message to confront David, there's no guarantee that David's not going to do to him what he did to his new wife's ex-husband. There's no guarantee that David won't just kill Nathan right there on the spot, because if he's going to kill his elite bodyguard to confront and cover up his sin, why not kill the whistleblower? See, here's the deal. It's risky. It's risky to confront evil behavior. It just is. There's always an inherent risk. No one likes to be confronted. No one does. You and me, none of us, right? Even when we know we're in the wrong, we don't like it, especially when we've got a vested interest in keeping what we've done, our sin, hidden. Nobody likes that. So Nathan's task is to confront his king, to obey God and just kind of let the chips fall where they may. And he does that. But Nathan's pretty shrewd about it. He approaches the king not with a shout, but he approaches the king with a story. Here's the story. There's a rich man, and he's got some friends coming into town to stay with him, okay? And so he's going to prepare a feast for them. And this rich man's got thousands of flocks and herds and livestock, and that's just kind of his story. Now, there's also a poor man, and he's just got one little ewe lamb. And he treats this little ewe lamb more like a son, more like a child, than a meal. And so when the rich man goes to prepare this feast, instead of taking from his own abundant resources, he just walks down the road and grabs this little ewe lamb and slaughters it and feeds it to his guests. Because he could. Now, David the king hears this story and he gets enraged. He just demands to know, who is this calloused, selfish, abusive, rich jerk? Because I am going to get to him what's coming to him. And Nathan looks at the king and responds, well, it's you. You're the guy. The hardest messages for us to receive, the hardest ones, are the ones delivered to the person in the mirror. Those are the hardest ones for us to receive. Why? Well, in David's case, because none of us wants to admit that we care so very little for those God cares about the most. It's a hard thing for us to admit. David goes on to have another son with this same newly widowed wife of his, and they name this son Solomon. And Solomon grows up to be the next king after his father David. And Solomon has a son. Solomon has a son named Rehoboam, and Rehoboam commits the same sin that his grandfather did. See, Rehoboam is third generation now, so he's inherited 2 generations of royal wealth. He's got a lot, but rather than just be content with what he's had and care for his subjects, he decides that he's going to demand more from them, demand more from the people who don't have as much as he does, more taxes, more forced labor from his subjects. Why? Oh, because he can. Because he can. And this splits the kingdom in two. 10 tribes form a kingdom in the north away from him under a king named Jeroboam. 2 tribes remain loyal to Rehoboam and join him in the south. And this begins a decline a decline that really we're going to unpack as we go. Because now there's 2 kingdoms, and they are just decades away from falling into destruction. And that's where we're going to jump into the story this weekend. Because the story is going to continue, and there's another prophet, not named Nathan, but there's another prophet named Amos, and that's the story. And Amos now has to confront not just a king, but he has to confront an entire nation. But he's got to confront an entire nation for the same reason that Nathan confronted David, and that is this: the nation cares very little about those God cares about the most. Welcome to Prairie Lakes, by the way. I should say that. We're glad that you're here. A little bit different of a start for us, and I understand that, especially on a weekend where most of our campuses, some last week, some next week, but a lot of us this week are celebrating baptism, so special welcome to you if you're in the room for the first time. Here's where we're at as a church. Twice a year, we like to sync up what we're doing on the weekends with what we're doing in our small groups. These are just groups of people that meet outside of church, usually in homes during the week, and we're just kind of dive deeper into some of the material that we're looking at this weekend. And we're beginning a series where we're doing that through the book of Amos. And this has kind of been our rallying cry at Prairie Lakes this year, where we want to be people who go deeper in relationship, but deeper in the right direction, okay? And so in case you're still in need of a heads up, it's going to be kind of a wild ride through Amos, because it's a super intense, very uncomfortable, highly confrontational book. And when I say uncomfortable, I mean it is. There's going to be points that are kind of uncomfortable, because as you're going to see, history is going to repeat itself. The same headlines that would have been in the newspapers 2,800 years ago when Amos was walking the earth, those same headlines, I read it this morning, they're in the news today. And so here's the thing, okay? God may have to confront you and me today like he had confronted his people almost 3 millennia ago. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn to the book of Amos. It is not an easy book to find, okay? So if you're in a physical Bible, it's like there. Does that help you? Your phone, a lot of us are on our Bible app on our phone, which is awesome. Table of contents, grab that. We have Bibles probably in the seats somewhere around you too. So as you find that, I want to share with you we're going to keep the slide behind me about this story arc, because hopefully it's going to help you grab onto what you're reading and discussing in your groups. There's just some background stuff. So here's the story arc again. So Amos, you can kind of see on the right-hand side here. I'm not a good weather guy yet on this thing. I used to be able to jump a lot higher than that too. Amos kind of lives in the decline, okay? So he lives during the time of Jeroboam II, which is probably around 140, 150 years after the pinnacle of the story, which is that King David. David really is the greatest king in the kingdom's history, and that's the pinnacle. But it starts to be divided after him, pretty soon after him, and then Amos comes even further after that. Okay, and we got the story of Rehoboam already. But Amos is going to come on the scene, and he's going to be from a town called Tekoa. And Tekoa is in the southern kingdom of Judah. There's a divided kingdom in the south. Judah is 2 tribes. Israel is 10 tribes in the north. And so Amos is from the south. He's from a little town of Tekoa, which is just south of Bethlehem, which is just south of Jerusalem. But Amos is going to prophesy. He's going to prophesy against the southern kingdom of Judah. He's going to prophesy against the northern kingdom of Israel. He's going to prophesy against the surrounding nations. Amos just has a lot to say, and all of it is negative, okay? Just heads up, all right? He's just got a lot to confront the people of the day on. Now, as you can imagine, nobody wants to listen to Amos, right? Nobody likes bad news, especially if it's about the person in the mirror. Nobody wants to listen to him, right? Nobody in the south, nobody in the north wants to give him the time of day. And part of the reason there too is because they're in pretty good shape still. I mean, there's some uncertainty in the world around these 2 kingdoms, but they're still in pretty good shape. They're still way better off, and a far cry from where they started in the story, which is wandering tribes through Egypt. But really, this story in the book of Amos is the story of a nation that's unwilling to admit its decline, because just 40 years after Amos prophesies, what happens is this. There's a kingdom in the north, Assyria, that swoops in 40 years after Amos and conquers the northern kingdom of Israel. And then what's going to happen about 140, 150 years later is Babylon in the south is going to come up, conquer Assyria in the north, and they will finish the job by conquering Judah in the south. So their destruction is just 4 decades away. And that's really the story if you're going to want to track world history in a really broad brushstroke. You've got Egypt, and then Assyria, and then Babylon, and then Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. And so the story is the Assyria-Babylon part, and Persia's not quite on the scene yet, but we're getting close to the rise of Western civilization, but not quite yet, okay? One more background thing that might be helpful for you before we kind of jump into the book itself. And by the way, you can take pictures. If you pull up your phone and want to take pictures, don't edit me out of the picture. That's going to be awkward for me, but the screens are great. This is just kind of a code, because there's a lot of nations and capitals and terms in the book that you're going to go, well, what is this? So go ahead and throw those up here. Sometimes it's going to refer to the nation by its country name, sometimes by its capital name, okay? And so Judah, Jerusalem, Israel, Samaria, you can kind of go all the way down. Assyria, Nineveh. Once you get to Gaza, which is a country in the south, they call those the Philistines. And then Edom, Moab, and Ammon are all nations surrounding, but they all have a common ancestor. Israel and Judah trace their ancestry back to a common ancestor of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. So when it describes those, these are kind of family feuds. They're nations that have grown apart. They're now sometimes at war, but they're in the same family, okay? So hopefully that's helpful to you. But anyways, okay. Let's dig into it this weekend. Amos chapter 1 is where we're going to be. And we're going to look at the first few words that Amos speaks out loud. So verse 2, chapter 1. And there's this theme that is going to be really clear in this verse. That's going to really be the foundation for the series. And that's judgment over comfort. He's just done with allowing his people to stay comfortable. And he's going to pronounce some judgment on them. Okay, so Amos 1. Let's look at verse 2 together. Let's read verse 2. Amos said, "The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, and the top of Carmel withers." Okay, so you look at that verse, even like they're on the screen there, and what you see is there's some indents, and that's intentional, because this isn't a newspaper narrative. This is a poem. If we had read it in the original language, it would have rhyme and rhythm and meter to it, And in fact, that's what the book of Amos is. The book of Amos is a collection of poems. And so, when you read poems, you're going to expect to encounter metaphor and imagery and symbol, and you're going to have to kind of interpret some of that. So let's do that here in verse 2. Let's just unpack some of the imagery that's here, because it's going to set the tone for the entire book. Amos starts by using God's personal name, Yahweh. But whenever the scribes translated it, they would translate it as Lord, and they would then put it in caps so you knew, because they're trying to keep God's name reverent, okay? But they want you to know, this your God, personal God, the God that you think you know, that knows you, that's who I'm talking about here. And he says that God is roaring like thunder from Zion, okay? So let's talk about Zion. Zion's a term that's got several different layers of meaning. The most literal meaning is it refers to God's dwelling place in the temple, and within the temple, more specifically, in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. They referred to this place where God dwelt on earth, where heaven and earth collided, as Zion. But then underneath that, they almost kind of saw it as God's capital or his county seat. It's where like the epicenter of his kingdom and his government and his rule and his reign began, and even pointed to like this future hope, because maybe one day, like it is right now, every single day in Zion, maybe one day like it's going to be that way across the whole earth. So that's the layers of meaning. But Amos says God is thundering from Zion. He's thundering. He's roaring almost, right? Like he's angry. And the result of his anger is going to be like the pastures are going to dry up and the top of Carmel is going to wither. What does that mean? Well, pastures are lowlands where you would take sheep for rest and refreshment and safety and quiet. And then Carmel is a mountain. It's where you would go to kind of get away from it all, or to get perspective, or in a wartime for defense, okay? And so essentially, here's what verse 2 is saying. It's saying God is angry, and there is nowhere you can go, high or low, to escape his judgment. That's how Amos starts his message. And that's a scary thought. It's a terrifying thought even. And I'm not kidding you when I say there's more than a few of us who have had that thought, and perhaps even spent a good amount of time and money in therapy or in our relationships trying to unpack that thought and get past that thought. Now, thankfully, when Amos continues to talk here, he starts not talking about God's people, but he's talking about all those evil nations surrounding the nation of Israel and Judah, okay? Which was a relief, I'm sure, to the people who first heard. And even maybe they probably celebrated the first part of this message. That's right, pronounce God's judgment against all those evil nations around us. And here's really, I mean, you read chapter 1, it's judgment against the surrounding nations for crimes against humanity. It is brutal. It is brutal in chapter 1. And we're not going to read all of it. And just heads up on some a little bit more mature themes here. But in verse 6, chapter 1, he's going to pronounce judgment against the Philistines for human trafficking. And the same against Tyre in verse 9. They're grabbing entire communities of people and they're selling them. In verse 11, he pronounces judgment against the Edomites for violence against women. And the same in 13, only it's violence against pregnant women. Just brutal stuff. Chapter 2, verse 1, he's going to pronounce judgment against the Moabites for desecration of graves. I mean, there's just some horrible things these nations were doing. But then Amos turns his megaphone of judgment, not out, but then kind of closer to home. I mean, he talks about his own countrymen, the country of the nation of Judah. And he says, my brothers and sisters have rejected God and rejected his ways and embraced idolatry. And then he gets really to the audience that is going to dominate the rest of the book, and he starts talking to the northern kingdom of Israel. And in verse 6 and 7 of chapter 2, here's the judgment, okay? This is what the Lord says, for 3 sins of Israel and even for 4, I will not relent. Here's what's going on. They sell the innocent for silver, so they're human trafficking. The needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, just walking all over him like it's no big deal. And they deny justice to the oppressed, okay? And this is going to be a theme. This is going to be the theme for the rest of the book. It's not the only thing God's going to judge Israel for, but it is the main thing. The straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing. The judgment is this. He's going to judge Israel for caring so little for those God cares about the most. And just to be super specific, he's going to judge Israel because they don't care about people in need who can't help themselves. That's what God is just sick of. You don't care anything about people in need who can't help themselves. And Amos uses 4 different terms, okay, to describe those people. What does he say? He says it's the innocent, it's the needy, it's the poor, it's the oppressed. 4 different terms. He uses 4 different terms, I think, because it's a pretty big umbrella. And we don't want to kind of admit it ourselves, right? So he's going to cast a wide net to kind of say, no, it's probably true of you, say? So if you would, let me just kind of inject some maybe modern 2025 examples. In other words, if Amos were writing this today to us, if he were pronouncing this kind of judgment today to us, who are the 2025 people in need who can't help themselves? And this, my friends, is going to be where it gets a little close to home. Heads up. I think Amos would talk to us about foster kids. I think Amos would be talking to us about kids who don't have dads in their lives. Maybe moms, but usually they don't have dads in their life. I think he'd be talking to us about them. I think Amos would be talking to us about elderly people whose kids have abandoned them. People in need who can't help themselves. I think Amos would be talking to us about refugees and immigrants fleeing for their lives and their safety. I think Amos would talk to us about women in abusive relationships. I think Amos would be talking to us about disabled people who can't work. I think Amos would be talking about people who were born into generational poverty or third world countries. I think he'd be talking about people wrongfully convicted or people who are rightfully convicted but want to rehabilitate. There's a whole host of people, right, in our world today who, for a variety of reasons beyond their control, can't help themselves, or at the very least aren't in as good of a position as we are to help them. And their lives are only going to get better if those of us who can help ourselves choose also to help them. It's something God cares deeply about. And it's why Jesus is quoted as, and he is the same thing. Jesus is he's a lot of things. One of the things he is a prophet. So he says this in the spirit and the heart of Amos in Matthew 25. This is what Jesus says, okay? Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." It's the same categories, just a little different language. And he elevates people who make it their mission to do that. And then he goes on to say this, right? Then he'll say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." That seems really harsh. Why? For I was hungry and you gave me nothing. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing. I was a stranger, you didn't invite me. I needed clothes, you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't look after me. And just so we don't miss it, Jesus summarizes it by saying this: "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." The least of these, people in need who can't help themselves, people that the Father and the Son care most about. From Amos to Jesus, the message is the same. If you're really a part of God's family, you will care about these people. You can't say that you're in if you don't. That is the message. Now this is where it gets a little, I'm going to use the word insidious, like kind of, I don't know, sneaky and maybe hard to kind of see just how bad things are here, right? Because it's really difficult not only to see, but to accept these kind of messages and to acknowledge that we might be the target of those messages. Like we might need to hear these things ourselves. Like maybe we've gotten far off in a way that we don't want to quite admit. We just don't feel like judgment's coming for us, right? We see what Amos is saying. We see what Jesus is saying. But is that really true of me? Really? I'm not going to lie to you, right? I told you that story up front about David and Nathan on purpose, right? Because I don't know this for sure, but if I was a betting man, I bet you the night before Nathan told that story to David, I bet you Nathan did some negotiating with the guy in the mirror. Like, are you really going to say that to him tomorrow, you know? And the reason I'm betting that is because I've done the same, you know? Like, I've exactly the same. Like, are you really going to say that, you know? Here's what I'm going to ask. Over the course of these next few weeks, we're going to say some things that are just going to be uncomfortable to hear. And maybe we already did. But I'm going to ask you to hang with us, because if you can get through that, or maybe better put, if you can allow these messages to get through to you, if you can allow God to let these messages sink in to your heart, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to promise you, what's on the other side of that is transformation. It's a heart that looks a little bit more like the people Jesus describes who are on his right. I think that's what we want. I think I want a softer heart. I want a heart that looks more like Jesus' heart, and I want a life that reflects a little bit more of how he says it should look. Remember our lesson from David's story, okay? The hardest messages to accept are the ones delivered to the person in the mirror by far. And we have a tendency to insulate ourselves from those messages. We just do. We like to kind of construct a life where they either can't get through, or if they can't get through, they kind of bounce off, okay? And so I'm just asking you to maybe take off your armor a little bit and allow God. So just preview, and then we're going to pray and do some celebrating together at some of our campuses here. So over these next few weeks, there's going to be two categories and two responses. You can either insulate yourselves from these messages of judgment, or you can allow God to confront you in your comfort. Okay? It's a decision. And there's just, if you want to kind of just, what are we talking about? And where we go to Amos 5 and 6. He's going to talk about people who build up wealth for themselves versus people who help their neighbors in need. He's going to talk about people who long for God's return and judge all those enemies instead of maybe judging themselves first. He's going to talk to people who see that I can just go to church and I can act like God's rubber stamping my life. And Amos is going to go, hey, nope, we have to worship through justice for the powerless. And he's going to do this. This is the one I'm really kind of nervous about. Amos is going to confront people who are just so proud of their country, as though their country is in great shape with God. And Amos is going to say, your country is not the exception. Kind of uncomfortable, but really good. Let me pray for us, and then we'll get to some baptisms. Father in heaven, thank you. Thank you for these hard messages. I know I need to hear them, and I know we all do, God. And we want to be more like your son, Jesus, on the other side. We really do. And all of us, God, have a tendency to insulate ourselves from these messages. But God, you remind us and remind us and remind us that there are people in need who can't help themselves. And it is our job. It's our privilege, our calling, to be people who help them. And God, remind us of our stories. We've screwed up our lives, all of us. And yet you have been. And you've met us in our need. Right for where we're at. God, some of us have even David's story. We screwed up our relationships or our marriages. We screwed up our kids. We screwed up our careers. God, and yet you've met us right where we're at. You've been so generous to us. God, would you help us be that kind of generous to the people who need it the most? So Jesus, we pray all of this in your name. Amen.